name is Jeff Seabold, along with Becca Franks. I direct the Wild Animal Welfare Program here at NYU, and we are delighted to be having a special keynote talk in advance of our Wild Animal Welfare Summit, which will take place tomorrow and Friday. So really looking forward to seeing those of you who will be here in person for that. And we are starting this event with a talk and discussion with a wonderful scholar, Alejandra Echeverri, and and we are going to do our standard format for these events. So in a moment, I will introduce our speaker, and then there will be about a half hour, give or take, of a talk. And then following that, Becca Franks, co-director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program, will have a one-on-one conversation unpacking some of the themes and relationships between conservation and wild animal welfare. And then we will open it up to questions and comments from both the in-person and the online audiences. And so those of you who are here in person, you can be thinking about what you might like to say, and we can hand you a mic when the time comes. Those of you who are tuning in online, you can enter questions or comments at any point in the Q&A tab on Zoom. And then when we reach that point in the conversation, we can present your questions and comments to the speaker. So just a brief word about the program and some of our co-sponsors before we get started. The Wild Animal Welfare Program is a research, outreach, and field building program housed within the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection in the Department of Environmental Studies here at NYU. And we examine what wild animals are like and how humans and wild animals interact and how we can improve our interactions with individual wild animals at scale. And we do that through the humanities, the social sciences, the natural sciences, law and policy, trying to take this multidisciplinary, problem-oriented, integrative perspective. And we are joined for this particular event by NYU Animal Studies, which asks these questions about animals writ large, by the Office of Sustainability, by All Animals Initiative. There are lots of partners to come together for these conversations. So thank you to everybody who supports this work. Now, without further ado, Alejandra Echeverri is a biodiversity conservation scientist whose research sits at the intersection of neotropical ornithology, conservation psychology, environmental policy, and biocultural conservation. Her lab integrates field biology with social science methods to understand human-nature relationships and co-produce evidence-based environmental policies with indigenous peoples, local communities, and governments. A National Geographic Explorer, CFAR Israeli Global Scholar, United Nations Youth Advocate, and Stanford Rising Environmental Leader, her work has been featured in the Washington Post, Forbes, Elle, and Nature News. Born and raised in Colombia's Coffee region, she is committed to training the next generation of conservation scientists and advocating for women, Latinx, and youth in STEM. So please join me in welcoming Alejandra. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for having me. I've had such a joy in this department today, meeting so many professors, and I've realized that it's so much fun. You have all the assistant professors here. I have to move here. Also, I want to acknowledge this is the first talk where I have someone in the audience who's a member of my family. After 13 years of living abroad, I've never had, English-speaking members of my family listen to my talk, so good to see you. All right, so I'm going to start this talk, and I title it From Grackles to Falcons, Why Human Stories Matter for Wildlife Conservation and Wild Animal Welfare. And before I start, I want to acknowledge that we are sitting today in the Lenape-Hoking land, the ancestral lands of the Lenape peoples. And I celebrate all indigenous peoples and local communities that stand strong in preserving their nature and their culture in our planet today. So a lot of what I'm going to present today is not going to be very new to you, but I think we want to start by saying that at the root of a lot of issues we have with wildlife is human behavior. So, for example, human-wildlife conflicts across species and geographies, be it in the global north, like California, Canada, with the bears, it's the human behavior that has brought more and more bears and humans into contact. For example, by having trash cans out, and as someone in the Lake Tahoe Bear League said, we have more and more naive humans because we have more and more foreigners or new to Lake Tahoe people coming in, leaving food in the car, and more like and smarter bears teaching their cubs where to find it. So it's actually humans have habituated them to do that. In the global south, we have very similar interactions, although with an equity issue, knowing that most of the farmers, often low income, are the ones that are being hit the hardest with human-wildlife conflict. But again, it's humans' behavior where we planted agriculture, for example, interrupting migratory routes of species like elephants that caused a lot of that. But that puts us in a very negative headspace, knowing that humans have been a problem, and especially is very sad for our children and for the next generation. I teach conservation psychology, and it makes me very sad to see the new generation of students, some of you in the room, being filled with eco anxiety. And so I want to start also thinking that humans and human action and human behavior is also at the root of all the solutions for wildlife conservation, for human wildlife flourishing, for coexistence. So, for example, cases where species have been recovered, like the pangolin, really depend on humans to breed them, to teach them how to get rewilded. The pandas are actually a successful conservation story with could not have been possible without the human intervention. So humans are very important too. So the way I structured my talk today was to really focus on human behavior, and there will be three parts of this talk. First, we're gonna talk about what motivates human behavior and how we can change it. And I have three case studies for you: sea otters, peregrine falcon, and then messaging experiments with the Hawaiian crow, alala, and chimpanzees. We're also going to talk about cultural values and which species are important for human cultures and how to change those values. And the third part, I hope, to give an uplifting final message in future flourishing. So let's start with this first part. So how can we how can we motivate people to adopt more pro-wildlife behaviors and change attitudes? So we know that especially, and it's actually important here in New York, there's a lot of the legislation that has been passed to protect animals, and especially with animal welfare and animal conservation, has started with protests, with people going out, with petitions, with pledges that is often the youth that is being pushing our legislators to do that. And then, as I said, with the pandas, like they depended so much on human behavior, for instance, in donations to endangered species conservation, captive breeding, and all the marketing around them. So for this part of my talk, I'm going to use the value attitude behavior model from the Colorado State University. So here, this cognitive and behavioral model suggests that values underpin basic beliefs that underpin attitudes, which can then lead to behavioral intentions and behaviors, with values being very few in number, stable, central to beliefs, and that they transcend situations. So for example, if a value is honesty, you would be an honest person at work, an honest person in your family, and that's what stable and transcending situation means. And as you work up towards this hierarchy, you get to behaviors which are numerous, quick to change, peripheral, and very context dependent. So thinking about this in the context of, for example, public support for saving endangered species, we can think that a person might have some values like an egalitarian ideology, which then can underpin a central belief like all mammals have equal rights to live. that then might shape how people view an endangered species, like the sea otters that are endangered and listed on the Species at Risk Act in Canada. And then they might decide, well, what should I do about this? Should I donate, volunteer at an aquarium, watch a documentary? And at the end, they donate $5 for conservation. So this is kind of how this proposed model is supposed to work. But then we can think that the same type of model can work, like the same person has a egalitarian ideology, has the same basic belief that all mammals have equal rights to live. And then you might say, well, then invasive hippos left from the Pablo Escobar era of the narcos in Colombia should have a right to live. So then they might say, should I comment on social media or participate in public outcry? Should I sign a petition to defend the hippos? And then they go and sign a petition. And in this case, this is a behavior that would contravene ecologists' recommendations because it's an invasive species shaping all the ecosystem of the Magdalena River. So I'm going to walk you through an example of the sea otters in Canada. So sea otters were distributed between all the west coast of US, all the way to Baja California and in the Gulf of Alaska. And then they were extirpated for much of their range. So right now there's almost no sea otters between California and the West Coast because of the fur trade by Russia. But then sea otters were very important, right? Like this is the classic study or example of a keystone species where sea otters eat sea urchins. Sea urchins are the ones that eat the holdfast or like the roots of the kelp. But when the sea otters are around, the sea urchins are, like managed so that this kelp forest can have a bunch of different animals in the ecosystem. And because they predate so much on sea urchins, like an adult sea otter can eat up to like 500 sea urchins a day, then they really shape whether this becomes a kelp forest or an urchin barren. So completely different types of ecosystems. So in the 1960s, sea otters were reintroduced to the west coast of Vancouver Island, where they were native. But by then, there had been 3 generations of people that had gotten used to ecosystem without sea otters, that had started some fisheries of like gooey ducks and shellfish. But then the organizations that work on environment and conservation reintroduced sea otters, saying that they have existence value, they represent what a natural ecosystem should look like, and that tourists would really like to watch these sea otters. Meanwhile, the local fishermen, mostly First Nations fishermen, for 2 generations said, well, we had already switched to not using sea otters in the pelt anymore, and now we are having a rapid shellfish population decline because the sea otters were eating all the urchins and all the shellfish. And so they were claiming that this is a problem of traditional cultural loss. But then this is a story that from the perspective of conservation biology, the sea otters are a conservation success story. They have come back like crazy because there was so much food for them. And Jeannie Eckert, a biologist at the University of Alaska, said this is the incredible conservation success story. A species that was wiped out has come back. But that has led to concerns in fishing communities, and sea otters are hated and they are shot in some places. And they are listed as an endangered species. So behavior of like calling them or shooting them, it's illegal. So for this was actually one of my first research projects I ever did as a master's student. I did a messaging experiment where I used the stories of the sea otters to test what would connect more with the Vancouver urban population. So I presented in an experiment 3 different conditions. So I had Some people watch those positive effects on the ecology, so learning about the benefits of sea otters as a keystone species. Some learning about the negative impacts of them in the ecology, so like highlighting more the human-wildlife conflict with First Nations and local fishermen, and then having a control that just presented facts about the sea otters. So this was a before and after control impact experiment. So what you can see here, I'm going to show you, everyone answered the Likert scale items, then they got one of those three conditions. In purple, you're going to see negative, positive, and neutral in green and blue, and or in shapes. And so here you see that, for instance, people saw that it is important to maintain healthy sea otter populations in order to maximize economic benefits from fisheries. So people who saw that that message about the conflict with the fishermen thought, yes, we should actually control. So they were more likely to agree with that statement after. And those that watched the biological facts, it actually thought, no, we should keep them. Then another one that changed attitudes was the sea otters have to be controlled when they cause major economic losses to commercial fishermen, and only the negative message had an impact on how people answered that one. And then management plans for sea otters should enable active human use of the species, and they thought, yes, we should have some species call for human use. So in this case, even with a short experiment, we were able to show that messages that elucidate human-wildlife conflict generate public support to call an endangered species, even one that is charismatic and beloved like sea otters. And that in this context, negative messages were way more persuasive than positive messages at changing attitudes. So then 10 years later, I think something like that. 10 years later, I became a professor at Berkeley, and I wanted to keep trying these types of messaging experiments, but then I needed students to help me do it. So then the next one I'm going to talk about is the peregrine falcons case. So here I draw from Paul Slovic framing on the psychology of risk and psychic numbing, where Professor Paul Slovic has found that in his experiments, that when you have a single story of one person that is suffering, say, often like the way these charitable donations worked were like children in Africa. When you have one identifiable life and you tell the story of one kid, and then you say, well, 1,000 kids are malnourished, people actually donate more to that single kid than to like thousands of lives, right? And even with just one more person, so if you tell the story of just Rokia or just Musa or both of them, still the donations and the feelings of empathy drop even with one more person. So that's called psychic numbing, where if we have numbers of lives, you actually care so much more about one life and two lives, and actually thousands are very hard to act upon or create that empathy. So this paper, if I look at the mass, I will never act, shows that. And it explains why we see, for instance, in altruistic behavior, like after a hurricane or after a refugee crisis, we see that donations spike as soon as there's like one good story, and then it declines. Like this is not a sustained effort. So we wanted to know, does this happen for wildlife, for endangered species conservation? So here we apply this question, like does psychic numbing apply to endangered species conservation? We evaluated the case of Annie, who's a very famous celebrity falcon in UC Berkeley. So Annie and the chicks have 18,000 followers on Instagram. People get to watch them hatch their every year. She would lay like 3 or 4 eggs, 3 eggs, I think, and then the students get to vote on how to name them. There's like stickers, and no, we are Cal Bears, so they're not our mascot, but I'm proposing we switch them because peregrine falcons were also a very successful conservation story in the US. This was a species that was also declining because of the DDT crisis, and their shells were too thin of their eggs. But then after DDT were banned, this species came back to the point that it really breeds in the campanile and the tower. So there's falcons breeding every year. So we wanted to see if that happens. Like, can we tell any story versus like how many peregrines were extinct, how they came back, and see if that happened. So as you can see here, actually, I did not simulate this data when Alex, so this was work done by my lab tech, Alex Boren. When Alex showed me this, I was like, did you just copy paste the data? They are exactly the same, like absolutely no difference by the celebrity falcon story, the statistics, or our control, which were just facts. So no changes in behavior in donation. But when we looked, we also asked people to write the 3 words that come to mind when you think of peregrine falcons or Annie, and then we asked them to do it again, and then we coded them by sentiment. You see that for the statistics, everyone was very sad to hear the story that these falcons like are like, when you say think about an endangered species, is actually very negative affect, right? Like all that eco anxiety is coming through. But after you tell the story that they came back, actually it becomes so much more positive, right? So conservation, protect. So one thing we learned is that in this case, negative messages are often more persuasive for endangered species like the sea otters. But here, maybe the celebrity falcon, because it was not a species that was declining, we didn't get that psychic numbing effect. But we actually see that telling stories of animals thriving changes people's sentiment and affect throughout the experiments. So now I'm going to show you a third experiment that we've been working on. My students were actually working on it yesterday and sent me the results so I could work on this one last night in the plane. But we're going to talk about empathy and Alala and chimpanzee. So this is actually some very new work that we are actually just resubmitted last night to the journal. So this is work in collaboration with Professor Chris Crupenier and his student Luz Carvajal, who are at Hopkins. And here we brought together 3 fields. So we brought together wildlife management and conservation, animal cognition, and ethics. And what we were thinking is like, how can we think and adopt more the thoughts of animal cognition to generate empathy with people? So what we've been learning is like animal cognition, for instance, if we walk through the elephant example, these would be things like problem solving, threat assessment, social learning, how much is happening between generations of elephants, the individual personalities. But as biologists, we're very good at thinking about population and less so about individuals. So cognition of the individual animals is often ignored. And what that happens is that deterrence methods like the fence I showed you don't work because they might learn that you can throw a tree to break the fence. They also learned that they had like chili crops and firecrackers. They learned how to like eat a plant first so that they wouldn't get as spies. Like they're just so smart, right? And that's because we weren't thinking about the cognition of the animal. But if we apply it, and that's the case of the bee fences, they were starting to try bees. Elephants are terrified of, especially African elephants. And so they started to create a fence where you have beehives, and then just they would intersperse like a real beehive with just sounds of bees, and they would not come close at all because that's getting at their cognition and their evolutionary fear of things that they have learned that it's bad for them. And so if we use that and then we use it to communicate, like say, tell people that, oh, elephants learn all these things, and we use better storytelling about animal cognition, we might actually end up with the shared outcomes that we want, which are like mutual flourishing, reduced conflict, and a way for us to live alongside elephants. And so for this experiment, Casey, who's another undergrad in my lab, we wanted to test this empirically. thus highlighting species cognition increased public support in conservation efforts. And we wanted to pick species that are very smart, that have high cognitive abilities, one that is very human-like cognition, like chimpanzees. It's very easy to relate to the way they understand the world because we understand it in very similar ways, and one that has a very different cognition but is ranked as having high cognition, like the Hawaiian crow, the alala. And both are endangered. The alala, it's a species that is extinct in the wild. There's only 22 pairs left in captivity at the zoos. And last year was the first successful reintroduction of a few alala chicks into the wild in Maui skies. But when we started this, they were only in captivity, and chimpanzees are endangered. So here we did an experiment where we had a 2x2 design where we had the same video and we presented information about just conservation, of telling people how endangered they are, how many are left, or just cognition, where we presented like just how they use tools, and then combined of like presenting a little bit of both to see if we would generate both empathy and urgency and see if these types of messages would be more synergistic for endangered species conservation. And do I have sound if I play this video? Okay, let's try. Okay, let's see. So this is the one video that is the alala and the cognition experiment. So can you hear it?
Researchers have discovered that the alala can use tools to get food, like twigs to fish out insects from tight crevices. What's more, they do it without being taught. These crows don't just use tools, they select, modify, and even improve them. They've been seen crafting hooks or stripping bark to make perfect utensils. In some cases, they can retrieve food from deep cracks in under 60 seconds. Pure problem solving. This ability is species-wide. Every alala studied showed an instinctive dexterity, like they're born engineers. Even more interesting, there's evidence these birds may have episodic memory, the ability to recall specific past events, a trait once thought to be uniquely human. As we learn more about these birds, the alalas continue to surprise us, showing just how clever, capable, and truly smart they are. This is the alala.
Oh, there you go. So that's just one of the conditions, and we had like 8 of them because that's the cognition for alala, but then we had the 2 species and 2x2 design. So what we learned of doing this, here are the 4 experimental conditions, is that for people who had the cognition and the combined for both species, they say that the animal's cognitive skills described in the video were impressive. And if you see in the Likert scale plots here, the strongly agree, you actually get much more interesting, cognition, obviously, that was what the message was highlighting in those 2. Then when we split by species, alala actually became an animal they can learn more, but we attribute that to familiarity because people are more familiar with chimpanzees. They might have more preconceived notion of what that animal was. And do they feel more empathy toward this animal after watching the message? For alala, it changed more. So we found in this experiment that the experimental condition had an effect in attitudes towards animals, and both cognition and combined messages had a positive impact on empathy and learning attitudes towards both endangered species. But then when it came to behaviors, we asked people like, can you sign a petition to save this endangered species, or donate to research on animal cognition, or can you donate for the research or the conservation? We find, again, very similar distribution of the behaviors. This is like how many people signed the different petitions, and like absolutely no difference between conditions. And when we ask people, why didn't you donate or why didn't you sign the petition, they would say mostly Financial constraints, fair enough. They're students, that's how we do a lot of the psychology experiments. But they also said like, no, there's like a informational gap, like I still need to know more. This was a very short video. So right now we only have evidence to say that these types of messages are working for attitude change, but there's still a lot that we need to do to get behavior change. And so just to summarize this part of my talk, I've explained that value, attitudes, and behaviors, this model gives real levers for changing how people treat wildlife. That messaging is double-edged. It can rally protections for sea otters, but it could also build public support to cull them, especially as an endangered species. The negative framing was the most persuasive, but a beloved individual like Annie DeFalco resisted that psychic numbing. And that cognition messaging raised empathy and learning, but did not move donations or petitions. Feelings shift before behavior. And I know this is a week where we're going to learn a lot about animal welfare. So here, my welfare bridge is that framing can decide whether individual animals are protected or killed. So how we tell these stories is itself a welfare intervention. So let's move on to the second part of my talk, where we're going to talk about the cultural value of animals, and I'll start with examples of grackles and mannequins. So there's a lot of culturally important species for different cultures. We've seen for generations, carvers across the world have decided to carve, for instance, ravens and bald eagles more frequently than, say, a sparrow, right? And there's some animals that are really beloved and people pay a lot of money to go find for bird watching, and now we're trying to claim that, recall it just birding, to be more inclusive of different abilities. So when we think about the benefits that birds give to people, we can categorize them into 4 ecosystem services. So there's provisioning services, or the things that we gather directly from birds. For example, we hunt birds, so we obviously take their meat, we take their feathers, we take their eggs. When we think about regulating services, are the benefits such as pest control, because birds can, for instance, eat pests in different crops. When we think of supporting services, there are birds that cycle nutrients between marine and terrestrial environments. And when we think of cultural services, there are birds that become symbols and are revered. For instance, the quetzal is the name of the, this resplendent quetzal is in the flag of Guatemala, is the name of the currency of Guatemala, and it's god for the Mayas. So this was empirical work I did as a PhD student in Costa Rica, actually, where these frogs live. And I did this work with the help of 6 field assistants, local field assistants. There I did 30 interviews, and I did 404 surveys with bird watchers, farmers, and urbanites. And I would show people like one illustration of each species and then play their song, and then ask about 12 or 13 species per person. But I actually had rotate the survey so that all 200 species in the regional pool would be ranked. And I would do things like ask, say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree that this is a beautiful bird and that you enjoy watching it? Has anyone seen a long-tailed mannequin here? Okay, so on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you think this bird is beautiful? Show me with your hands. 5, 5, 5, 5, 3, 5, 5, 5. So then I would do basically that and just average. So this would get like a 4.9 because someone scored it at 3. So after doing that, I learned that the types of cultural services that people derive and construct with birds are that some birds are valued for education. So, oh yeah, I should mention that this is an item that would get at, obviously, the visual aesthetics, but I designed it so that we would capture a lot of intangible benefits and then see through a factor analysis how they would cluster. And so I learned that there would be education benefits. So some birds are important because they were either the study species of some ornithologists or they wanted to teach their kids about them. In bequest, those were the ones that people wanted to protect for future generations. In bird watching, were like the mannequin at the Quetzal, those that are beautiful and that people find beautiful. In acoustic aesthetic, those that have a beautiful song and that people wanted to wake up to in the morning. In identity, those that reflected the identity of the place or the landscape. And in the services, some were obviously not all provide benefits. Some are perceived as a nuisance or a pest. So those loaded in the opposite direction, and I call that disservices. So how do cultural services vary across stakeholder groups? I'm going to teach you, this is like a plot of like the Likert. So each dot here is a bird scored by, say, a bird watcher. And here is the median distribution. So for instance, here we see that from 1 to 5, all birds in total, farmers actually perceive higher acoustic value from birds than bird watchers and urbanites. And I don't have time to talk about the whole all the rest of the others, but you can read it in this paper. But then when you try to dig and get individual stories, that's when you get, I titled this paper, I won't tell you the title yet. And so this is the mannequin. People would say El Toledo is one of my favorites. I like how it dances and its colors. These are birds that have legs. So these are males. They dance together in a group of 5 or 6 males, and the females go between legs, picking which group of males is they're going to mate with. And the legs are usually family members. And then this was the great-tailed grackle. And then people would say things like, we must take care of all the birds because they are part of the nature that God left us. Everyone has a place in the ecology, in the system of each region. They must be there to do good. All the birds except the grackle. I don't like that one at all. You can laugh now. So what? Like, there was so much going on with the grackle that I actually had to team up with my friend Dina Dinat, who's a literary scholar from South Africa who studies South Africa in post-apartheid. Because I was like, I don't understand what to make sense of these comments. They would say, the famous grackle, they say it comes from Nicaragua. In fact, we had a bird that was similar to the grackle, but it has a different beak, and the grackle came to invade all the other birds. Not true. This is a species that is native to the mangroves of Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica. It's just expanded its range to there's now tons of them here in Texas. They can overwinter here. They used to migrate up and down, but they say, no, it's not Costa Rican. It's definitely Nicaraguan. Okay, then they say the grackle is a pest. It damages the nests of the other birds. We've seen it eating even its own sons. And they cause damage to the rice. They take up the rice. We did not have grackles around, and now there are many. We don't see them in the forest, only close to the house, and then they go to the rice crops. Yes, it's true, like their population has increased because this is a species that thrives with both land use change and climate change, and they are very aggressive. They do peck eggs of other birds. That's like part of the behavior. But they went as far as saying that if they are very destructive, they get here and eat the eggs of other birds. If they were a person, they would be someone who's bad. They would be the narcos. Like, so bad. And when we were talking with Dina about it, he said this is a case of eco-xenophobia because all that cultural identity, Costa Ricans have identified themselves as like the widest country in Central America, differentiating themselves from the Nicaraguan. The Nicaraguans come to Costa Rica to do a lot of the farming jobs and the local word. So yeah, they say this is not a local bird. Ours are the toucans and the manakins, the pretty ones. This is a very Costa Rican bird. But you know what's the most interesting is that as a Colombian, I could not believe how much they hate it because we love them. This is like an artist called Enrique Grau who made them the muse. So you see entire statues like in 5 different cities of Colombia of greater grackles. Like, look at the size of the car. This is like massive. in Cartagena, there are like paintings everywhere, and they are a symbol of Afro-Caribbean identity. And they even have a different local name. They're called Maria Mulata, and actually by calling it Maria Mulata, they are celebrating like that it's a mix between the whiteness and the blackness. And then actually in Costa Rica, there's Sanate, which is the Nahuatl name, Sanatl. So that makes a big difference. And just to end this part of the talk, for culturally important species, there's some important species in cultures like the grackle for us, but there's others that are very important and play an outsized role in cultures. So for instance, cultural keystone species have been described as species that have a role in supporting cultural identity, and they're the basis for religious, spiritual, and social cohesion, and provide common sense of place, purpose, belonging, and so on. And so there was this review paper by Victoria Reyes Garcia and her team who tried to understand how many of those culturally important species are culturally endangered, meaning that people forgot how to use them, how to cook with them, how to use them for medicinal purpose, and how many of them were biologically endangered by the IUCN red lists. And actually, if you see, there's only 7 that are both. But actually, what strikes the most of this is that a lot of the species fall in this quadrant of data deficient, least concern, meaning that many culturally important species that are globally are data deficient with regards to their biological vulnerability. And I couldn't believe that finding, so I tried to test if that was true for Colombia. And we used, with my students, we did some research on which are the plants that are used in artisan crafts. And so there were a lot of palms. For instance, this is the Astrocarium malibo, a plant that has about 12 local names, meaning at least 12 different indigenous groups use it and have a word for it. It's a palm that is very important for all the type of materials, like it's used in baskets, it's used in rugs. The birds use it to make nests. This is an Oropendula bird, also of like icterids, so same family as the grackles. And they make these like bird nest hanging, and then people say they learned weaving from the birds. It's a keystone species for the tapirs who eat when they have fruits. It's like brings all the animals. And guess what is data deficient? Like how is it data deficient? Like so we need new frameworks, I think, for studying biologically and culturally important and endangered species. So to end this part of the talk, people value birds for at least 5 positive cultural services, but dislike some, like the ecoxenophobia. Which species cherish or reject is very context dependent. Many culturally important species remain data deficient, and the welfare bridges that labeling animals as in place, like the xenophobia, or out of place shapes which ones are tolerated, fed, or persecuted. So I think those stories really matter, and we need new frameworks for human-animal relationships. And just to end this part, and I promise it would be fast, is the kind of future and ongoing work I've been doing. So I was going to present with you 3 cases that we've been working on. I was just in Istanbul, where we were doing a project with the human buffalo intimacies, and these are Anatolian water buffalo that have been kind of domesticated for milk, and they make the yogurt, the kaymat, very important to Turkish culture. But if you talk to the herders, they are semi-wild. They don't need to get, for instance, the treatments that cows would need to get. They don't need like assisted birth or anything like that. So they call them semi-wild. Well, we're working with giant tortoises in Galapagos and with tigers in India. And the reason I present them is because I'm tired of having that narrative of human-wildlife conflict prevail. Like we need a new language, and this is work being done with philosophers like Kristen Andrews for human-animal relationships. We need to think about mutual flourishing, not just how are we going to live with them and coexist with them, but how can we flourish alongside and share our ecosystems with them. So in Galapagos, my student Isabela Tapia Jaramillo, who was born and raised in the National Park of Galapagos, she's studying flourishing with giant tortoises. Right now, the Galapagueños have only lived on the islands for three generations. So she's the first generation to grow up there. So they have a whole identity that is very tied to the islands and the wildlife. These are like their typical dances, dresses, very different from continental Ecuador. But still they say we don't have culture and we're not allowed to touch the tortoises because that's national park. So with her, we're gonna do some socioecological research on how can we live and thrive alongside giant tortoises through tortoise-based tourism and celebrating wildlife activities, like maybe make a festival where people can learn about these animals. In Turkey, I just told you about the Buffalo Project, but this was a collaboration with Cooking Sections, who are two contemporary artists based in London, Alon Schwab and Daniel Fernandez Pascual. They were commissioned art for the Biennale of Istanbul 4 years ago, and their art is very political. So they decided to make art about an art exhibit and an installation about the yogurt producing culture, because these are migrants who were like pushed out to the margins of Istanbul, and now there's an airport that is cut through the paths of the buffalo, and this activity is kind of being threatened, and there's like very few spaces left for them. But then they created a festival, because in the festival, if they bring it with local researchers like Merve Anil and Kubilay Ersep, then the mayor has to acknowledge that these people live there. And now this is an example of starting with festival as a methodology, community engagement, celebrating the local practice of buffalo herding community and milk and yogurt, and then having a very political act of saying, well, they are here to stay. And they made them like art festivals, portraits, and so on. And the work I'm gonna start next year in India, I'm gonna be working with Prasenjit Yadav, who just got the cover of National Geographic and was voted Photographer of the Year for getting a picture of black tigers, and Kulu Suryawanshi, who is our lead PI on that, where again, tigers have been a success story by any conservation metric. They are rising. The Indian government's very happy, but tigers do eat people. And this is an example of a place where a tiger ate one of their elders. And because of their beliefs in reincarnation and because of the cultural importance of tigers, they build a shrine that is like, has some chains to let go of the rage and say, tiger, don't do this again, but we need to live with you. So we're gonna be doing some research on how to have and live and flourish with an animal that is culturally revered, but actually the conflict with this one is very different than with the ones I've shown. And so just to end, I've told you that human stories shape wildlife outcomes, that the values we hold and the way we frame a species move public attitude, support, and policy. I've shown you that messaging cut both ways, that it can rally protection or with negative framing build support to call a beloved endangered species, and how we narrate animal shapes, how they're treated. I've shown you that a single named individual can flip the story, like Annie the falcon resisted numbing, but then drew people in with the sentiment. I've told you that culture and biodiversity are entangled and changing together, but many cultural keystone species remain data deficient. I've told you that we need a new language beyond conflict, beyond mere coexistence, and toward mutual flourishing for people and wildlife alike. And here's my optimistic takeaway. I hope that you, like me, believe that humans are not only the problem, that with better stories, we are part of the solution. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Okay, let me get a mic. And all right. Ooh, that's loud. We'll begin. First, we'll have a short panel conversation, and then we'll open up to audience questions. What kind of time are we looking at here? Okay. So, yeah, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. And thank you for coming and sharing, some of the findings and the research from your field with this new emerging field of wild animal welfare. And I think that like you're really well placed to have these sorts of conversations, especially given your interest in, the way values shape behavior and attitudes and then action. And, in the service of like, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from the audience about specifics and specific questions, but just sort of to zoom out and sort of do that sort of field level comparison. I'd love to like just have a little like conversation about your perspective on sort of the values of conservation biology versus the values of wild animal welfare, thinking about, conservation biology very explicitly valuing populations, species, endangered species, and wild animal welfare valuing individuals, and how the sort of history of conservation biology really put those two things in tension. And like just to reflect a little bit on the story of conservation biology itself as a story about having one set of values that sort of, yeah, again, puts itself in contrast and in conflict with like caring about the individual animal.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yeah, I think conservation biology as like founded by Michael Sule, but before that, when it was like more like game preserves, it was really founded in the ethos of hunting. So there was a lot of game preserves in Africa, here with the bison ranches. Like it started that hunters were worried that they wouldn't have enough game to hunt. So they started to think, well, maybe we should have some sort of management policy so that we put some sort of like quotas and things like that so that we don't overhunt them and do population. So very early on population, and actually as a professor in Berkeley, I'm really feeling that history because my department was founded by Starker Leopold, the grandson of Aldo Leopold, and we have all the trophy heads around. Like it's still like there's a lot of game hunting management, wildlife going on. So that's why it started that way, with like more of like hunters' values at the core. I think more and more the new generation of conservation biologists relate with wildlife in a non-extractive way. So, like me, I go bird watching. I don't actually go shoot birds. But dog hunting is a big thing, so no problem if anyone does it. And so that's kind of where it started. But then as the field group is very different to think about population management with herbivores that are often what the hunters would target. Then when now we're thinking about reintroduction, rewilding, I think now the conversations of welfare and conservation biology are starting to become more and more important together because, say, with the tigers are growing, the population is growing, but they're very different tigers. And so a mom that learns that she can eat humans teaches the cubs that, but other moms don't learn that. And so then people from the ministry go kill the one that has that behavior. So I think that's an example where those two are actually starting to become more aligned. And then other species like the tortoises, that one is basically numbers because we only have 300 of them left. So we need to still know how to breed them, how to get them. But there's no research done on like what is a tortoise personality, or there's like zero research on cognition of the giant tortoises because right now the priority is like, well, there's 300 left. So we need to get the numbers up. We can't even have 2 or 3 in a lab where people can study how they think. So I think they're merging more and more.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that context. So I just have one more question and then we'll open up to the audience. And we have also an online audience that we have question ability to take from the online audience as well. So I guess Well, actually, maybe I have maybe two questions that I'll pack into one. But I think so. There's like so you have the psychic numbing effect that you talked about, which is a very strong and replicated effect when in the human to human psychology. And I wonder if what you're sort of discovering with your work and even the absence of it translating is sort of a reflection of that tension between the individual, valuing the individual in wild animal welfare and valuing the abstraction of the species or the population or like the vast numbers, the mass in conservation biology. And that like all of the interventions that sort of would work normally are about individuals, but the ask then becomes about the masses. So it's like a conservation ask. And I just wonder, like, A, what you think about that fundamental tension within the field itself. And then also, like, do you think things would change radically if the ask then became a welfare ask? And the welfare ask was, what if we looked after the individual? What if we thought about their emotional experiences and their well-being? If that would sort of like get people more engaged and make it start look more similar to the sort of psychic numbing effect. And then baked into that question is another question, which is like you've talked about art, and we have a bunch of art coming up in the summit. And I just wonder what the role of art plays in terms of like maybe being able to bridge that gap.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the first one's a very interesting one because when we were analyzing the data, we're like, why is this not working? Like, not only it didn't work in donations, it went the opposite way as our prediction in terms of attitudes. Like the statistical one, this did better. So we were wondering, yeah, like, is it that everyone has just drank the conservation Kool-Aid that as long as you say there's like they recover from 200 and now there's millions, like that actually made a difference. So we were wondering, is it because we're showing it thriving, like all the malnourished children in global south, they show them as like stunting and like you have to adopt one. This one was like a celebrity animal that is doing great. So we didn't know that, but now that you put this, like I think zoos have figured out this before our, but they don't give me the data to analyze it. But they figured out like with manatees, you can adopt a manatee, and so I think they learned this one we can do that type of stuff. I just don't know how far we can extend it to the more than human. Like, is it just for mammals or is it just for very specific mammals? Like maybe people will adopt a manatee, but not an elephant. I don't know. So there's more research there to be done. And I think targeting behaviors, it's true that like if I'm asking about Annie, but then the action was donate for falcon conservation, it wasn't donate to Annie. Oh, actually, it was donate to Annie, but still we didn't see any. It was like donate to Annie and her family. They're like, why? Like she already seems to be doing good. But actually, it's very sad because she was breeding in the company for 17 years, and last year the bird flu killed her, we think. But their new families moved in, so we will repeat this study. And then about the role of art, I will say that has been a very new lesson for me because in Istanbul, we had this case where the airport was placed right in the middle of the pastures, which, by the way, there were abandoned mines that the buffalo were roaming free and turned into pasture by wallowing on those pits that became like when the rain and the brackish water merged, like those are like buffalo pools, and then they have restoration ecology going on. So it was very unexpected how much they can repair the land. Then they put an airport right in the middle of their pastures and their migratory routes. And then apparently buffalo have very stubborn routes. So they kept going to the airport and they kept breaking the fence. So now there's like a airport gate or like a buffalo gate to go in and out because that's their meeting point where one of them gets lost from the herd. They meet up at the airport. So they would, no way. So then the artists were like, well, how would you do the policy for this? And Kulu and I, who are the conservation biologists, were like, we'll make a map, we'll put a tracker on them, see their path, and then give it to the policymakers and say, make a corridor. They're like, but these are people who are displaced. They are migrants from Greece. Like, the government does not care about them. So let's start with the art. If contemporary artists from London put the spotlight on this community, and then suddenly they care. And so this time we were there for the fourth festival. It was like they do it every year now. The mayors came from all 8 different towns. Now the local TV channel wants to do a series about this man because now they're so famous because they use those portraits. And now we can finally do wildlife corridors. But it was art that got us there because otherwise people don't even care about these animals or these people. So, yeah. Thank you so much.
We can open it up to the audience now if anybody has any questions. I see a hand right there. Wait for the mic to reach you. Go for it.
With the effects of the psychic numbing and the messaging that you talked about, was there any significant difference when the species was a charismatic species like the sea otters versus when it was a less charismatic or less visually appealing species like naked morats, as an example? Did the way that the animal looked and did the way that people view it have a significant effect on how that messaging was received?
So the only experiment that I replicated exactly with the species as a variable was the one of Alala and chimpanzee, and we did have an impact of species. The other two are completely different experiments, so I can't infer that that would matter, but I would suspect it does because the baseline attitudes towards a sea otter are probably very different than towards a peregrine falcon. But I could not respond to that statistically because they are not comparable samples or experiments.
Right next to you.
So I know that the first few slides you presented showed us how values drive attitudes and then drive behaviors. And I was curious whether you're familiar with any work that sort of views it from the opposite perspective, sort of the Benjamin Franklin effect of behaviors then drive attitudes as human beings sort of try to reconcile their behaviors with their underlying beliefs.
Oh, that's a good point. No, I've always done it to test it, like theory of recent action, theory of planned behavior, which is most commonly used in the conservation, psychology, human dimensions literature. But that's why I really want to read more social science and behavioral science, maybe also more from sociology, because psychology is the same. Like psychology values like individual behavior, but then sociology might value more like, well, if the collective behavior is this, then everyone will eventually shift values maybe by generation. I haven't used those frameworks yet to test any of that, but that's a good point. I can.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a similar question because in other contexts, for example, farmed animal welfare and dietary change, there is evidence, as far as I understand, that values can drive behavior and behavior can drive values in the right circumstances. And with respect to the latter, if, for example, for price, taste, and convenience reasons, people start naturally eating more plant-based foods, then they become more open to endorsing the ethical arguments for eating plant-based foods because their behavior already lines up with that. And I wonder if something similar might apply in the case of wild animal welfare. If you create the conditions where people are naturally disposed towards a certain kind of coexistence, would they then be more open to endorsing the arguments? And actually, that relates to another question I wanted to ask, and then we can go back to the audience, which is on the values drive behavior side, there are some suggestive studies that, again, in the right circumstances, values change can at least temporarily drive behavior change. And again, in the farmed animal welfare and food context, there was a really interesting 2023 study that replicated a more informal study from a few years earlier, where in a university context, when there was specifically a farmed animal welfare lecture and then breakout discussion sessions, the students who were exposed to that material, and it was, again, not only information, but argumentation about why animal welfare matters and the importance of dietary change for food system reform, when they were exposed to that level of information and arguments and active participation in those discussions, they then reported in surveys after the fact that they endorsed the arguments, and then in receipts that were collected from the cafeteria, there was a decline in meat consumption in comparison with a control group where they were not similarly exposed to that information and those arguments. Again, only suggestive, but it makes me wonder if there was not only the like information about cognition and the empathy, but an actual argument for why this matters and why we should take it into account, and then discussion and then some follow-on studies. I wonder if that could move the needle for wild animal welfare and conservation science.
Yeah, those are great points. And actually, it's true that so my PhD advisor, Professor Jane Zhao, leads a lab on behavioral psychology. And in her lab, we did a lot of experiments on recycling, cafeteria change, turning off the lights. Actually, her book just came out about why we should actually keep the lights on. and and then it was like about nudge theory. And when we were trying, we were learning that, at least in that lab and in that context, even in Vancouver, that is already such a environmentally minded like city and residents, we were learning that it's much easier to change behaviors of energy and food than it was about like donation to conservation or like volunteering for like wild animals. So I'm not sure if it's because the behavior cost is so much higher. Like food is an option in a way, but spending a whole day volunteering at the animal shelter, like it costs. So I'm not sure what behaviors we can target. But on that point, when we do field work, I do think like if we think about how different cultures relate with animals is so different wherever I go. Even just showed you like the grackles, right? Like how people see them and interact with them is very different. So I think maybe behavior could change or like reinforces values, and it's more like instead of a linear model, more like a bunch of feedback loops, right? Also, a lot of the stories and narratives were very clear by generations, because where I did my research, there was like one of the UNESCO blue places, or where people live the longest. So I interviewed people who are like 115 years old, but also 18 years old. And the 115 years old, they were like, I don't like that we can't take parrots as pets anymore. Like, really pissed at the new law. But then the youngs were like, I would never have a parrot as a pet. Like, that's a horrible idea. They live like 80 years. And so I think that's like law enforcing the behavior, then behavior shifting the values. And we see it very cut through by generations. And then with animal welfare and the stories and using a course or a whole module as an intervention, let's try it. I don't know. I think that's actually a very good idea, because what we see is that a lot of these things, it's like the Blackfish effect, the Harry Potter effect. When like a big important movie comes out like Blackfish, we see a huge dip in behavior. Like SeaWorld did not get a lot of visitors for a while. So that's a huge intervention, like the cafeteria. But then it is not sustained. So I wonder if through a class or a module, like maybe it's not sustained by the person, but then generations of cohorts of students coming through changing behavior, at least for a year, that would still have a huge impact, right?
Well, if you might like to work on that, the NYU
Let's do
Center
it.
for Environmental and Animal Protection would love to work with you.
Let's
Okay,
do it. I
that's
love
excellent.
collaborating.
New research project is coming online. So let's take another question from the room, and then we can go to one online. Yes, over in the back.
Okay, that sounds right. So I am I suppose, an environmental sociologist by training, if not necessarily by inclination. And I'm actually working on what's becoming a book manuscript about a community I did in ethnography, and that is very diverse politically, ethnically, culturally, spiritually, but where there's a really common attitude of considering land and ecology as part of the community, holding very strong pro-environmental values, even even among conservative people in this community. And one of the big findings was that folks across this very vast spectrum of identity had a dual dependence on their landscape. So they depended on it for their well-being, for their livelihood, for their money, for their food, but they also depended on it for their identity, for their sense of self, for making meaning in their lives. And even though environmentalists and ranchers and indigenous folks, who were some of the groups I was working with in this region, were also different from each other externally, because they all had this sort of dual dependence, they were able to come to these shared values and connection to place. And I wasn't looking as specifically at animals as I was at landscape and environment more broadly. But I just think it ties into this conversation that you're having. And so I just wanted to offer that as, it's not really a question, but maybe some food for thought.
Where is this community?
This was the Eastern Sierra Nevada of California, actually, so not too far from you, in the summer, at least, when the pass is open.
Yeah, thanks for that, and I can't wait to read your book. I think that your manuscript. I think it's we've been talking about this a lot in our department, because we were saying, like, is it landscapes, is it species? And I think Professor Justin Breshers came and gave a talk a few months ago, maybe. But Justin was, our offices are next to each other, and Justin was saying to me, well, but don't you think animals connect people to place? Like, it very clearly. That's why, like, there's like national animals or symbols in flags. And I think that can be true, especially for things like bison, bald eagle, salmon, obviously, like it's very, so I think some species do play a big role in that connection to land or water. But in other contexts, especially cities or where we've had more of that extinction of experience, it seems harder to get that connection, because people are more connected to things like their phone or screens. So I think if we try to look across cultures and places, even the Sierra Nevadas might be more similar to what happens in the Amazon than it is to what happens in like LA. So yeah, it's interesting.
Real quick, and then we have one online question. Go for it.
So just because that's such a great, and that's actually why I'm now doing a research project based in New York City to complement the rural study. And I think I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think simultaneously, this fascinating phenomenon you see is something like the pizza rat phenomenon, or the phenomenon of here at NYU, the obsession with like the red-tailed hawks, right, who are nesting on the library. And so even in these places where there is an extinction of experience, when people really attach themselves to animals, even in the urban context, as much like with Annie. But yeah, look up Pizza Rat. It's become quite an icon of New York.
Okay, I don't know about Pizza Rat. I have to read it. Well, hands up if you've ever seen a red-tailed hawk here. And this is an environmental science department, and that's like half the room. It's still like it's hard.
Okay, so we have a question from Sarah online that I want to make sure we get to before we wrap up. So Sarah was picking up on the discussion about sea otters and how people were more responsive to negative information than positive information. And Sarah was wondering, could that be explained by, for example, people already being exposed to the positive stuff, or people having a kind of positivity bias about sea otters? So for example, if they were already exposed to the positive stuff, then like further exposure might not matter much, but exposure to the negative stuff might be surprising and informative and move them more. Similarly, if they had a positive bias, then again, more positive stuff might not move them much, but persuasive negative stuff might move them more because of their starting point, not because of positive versus negative as such. So I was wondering if you had a response to that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think psychologists call that the ceiling effect. So it's like people already thought so positive about sea otters, it's almost hard to make them think even more positive, right? Like in a scale of 1 to 10, they were like 9.5. But it's easier to get them to lower, right? So there's like more room for attitudinal change if we think of attitudes as like divergent from positive to negative. Yeah, so that's definitely ceiling effect.
Well, we are about at time, so I think we should go ahead and wrap it up now. And everybody who is here in person can join us for a vegan reception outside. So, first of all, thank you again to Alejandra for being here. This is such a lovely talk. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And really, it's a really fun department. I'm having so much fun.
Awesome. And thanks again to everybody for being here. Really looking forward to the summit. For those of you who will be joining us for that over the next couple of days, thanks to Audrey Becker and Haun Rowe for running this event and the staff here. And let's hang out and talk some more. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good night to those of you online.
Thanks, everyone.